Hello, and welcome back to Book and Page, where we are on to the fifth act of Shakespeare's The Winter's Tale. We're finally gonna figure out how this play's ending. And boy, does it get even more confusing from here. So, like I normally do, we'll start with a brief summary of what happened in this section. We are just covering Act 5, Scene 1 today, and for our final video tomorrow, we'll be doing Scenes 2 and 3, where things get real bonkers. But for Act 5, we're actually returning to Sicily and Leontes, the king of Sicily, who has been in, well, a lot of guilty feelings and remorse and penance for the past couple of years, 16 so years, because of the death of his child, wife, and murder of his baby. So we actually meet Leontes along with Paulina and a couple of his lords. He seems to have taken Paulina into his confidence and does talk to her for advice. Now, the lords are trying to convince him that he needs to get married again and produce an heir for the kingdom, or everything's gonna go nuts when he dies. But Paulina's very quick to actually just shoot that idea down by reminding him of the fact that he killed Hermione, his previous wife. Yeah, it's... whew. So, the lords are kind of like, Paulina, this needs to happen, and because she's fighting against the lords, and she wants to keep Leontes as he is, she finally convinces him to swear an oath to her that he will not remarry unless she herself chooses a wife, and choosing a wife for him would basically be another Hermione, which is never gonna happen. So Leontes agrees to this oath and basically says, right, there's no woman like Hermione, so no wife for me. This gets interrupted by the arrival of some unexpected people. Well, for Leontes, we're fully expecting it because we're watching the play, right? And those unexpected people would be Florenzel and Perdita. Except Perdita's name is never said. He's introduced as the Prince of Bohemia with his princess. Ooh, and he comes in basically spewing tales about where he's been and why he's here, saying he's here on behalf of his father, and that Perdita is in fact a princess from, you know, over there, but like, she's my wife, everything's good, she's a princess, it's fine, except they get found out very quickly when a lord from Paulinias comes in and basically outs them as runaways and a shepherd's daughter. Leontes, though, turns out to be more willing to hear them out, and we actually end this part with him saying, hey, why don't we bring your father in, we'll figure all this out, I'll give you a fair shake, everything's good, she's really pretty, and Paulina's like, hey, right, no, was thinking about Hermione, that's all. And that's how we leave it. So we've got 2 more scenes after this to wrap up this play. And we spoke about how Act 4 sort of changed things, because we got this sense that we were going into a comedy, and then that comedy went dark real quick, and then turned into the possibility of a tragedy when Paulina sort of lost his head and got all, I'm gonna murder all of you for, like, convincing my son to marry a shepherd's girl. If you're wondering why the camera's slightly shaking, the cat's taken a leaning against it and has decided to have a bath. This production's a mess. So is this play, because we suddenly don't get a sense of where we are. Shakespeare, in going into Act 5, has sort of cut us loose from all genre conventions, because we suddenly jump perspectives, but not into Leontes, the tragic king, in the way of somebody like King Lear, where we watch them just unravel. But also, again, not into a comedic part either. we have a very human Leontes here who fully admits to his own mistakes and to the choices he's made and to the consequence of those choices. But we also have very human followers of sorts. Give me a second. Maybe if I just... There! That's a little better. Very human lords and ladies here with Paulina as well. Because what we actually have then, in very brief, because this is not the focus of any of this, this question is never going to get answered because of the fact that we've cut away all genre conventions here. We have a very brief question of what Leontes should do at this point in time. And this is a very interesting question, especially when you know the Greek context for the question. And I'm a little sad that I didn't think about this in advance. I didn't really remember that this was a concern in this play, however brief, which is the question of kingdom versus the holy kingdom, let's say, religious kingdom. Because what actually happens here in the very start of the scene, before we have Florenzel and Perdita come in, is a question of what Leontes should do in regards to the fact that he is king and must take care of a kingdom, versus being a religious man and following the religious code that he's been given. Because, very correctly, the lords point out that a king without an heir, historically, is an awful time for the kingdom. Because things just go sideways really, really quickly. And what's kind of funny is Paulina, who's fighting against this viewpoint, points out the fact that Alexander the Great didn't have an heir. And you're just kind of like, no, you've just leaned into the point that the lords are trying to make, which is systematically, that's not good. I hate to say it, but Alexander the Great's kingdom didn't peacefully get passed on to a randomly selected general that he had planned. Everything splintered and fell apart from there. And a lot of people argue that there's never been an Alexander the Great past that point who has brought so many disparate groups together and so many different peoples together, that's been reserved much more for legacies than anything else. And legacies that have clear heirs. Now, this isn't always true. If you take a look at Rome, there's definitely points where, like, the lineage is not clear, and we just pull a family out of nowhere, and we're like, bam! Okay, good. Go for it. Go for it. And this can even be some of the bigger ones, right? Augustus Caesar, not actually a clear heir to Julius Caesar. He might have been an heir in the guy's will, but there were definitely kids that Caesar had, most notably Caesarion with Cleopatra, which would have been a clearer heir, but no. Mark Antony tried to consider himself an heir. Also the fact that there was never supposed to be an heir because, Republic. So there are moments like that where the kingdom does alright, but there's always changes. And then unfortunately there's also moments like the War of the Roses, which I think a lot of people don't necessarily realize how awful that time period just in history was. But Shakespeare is starkly aware of it, because if you look at his English histories, which admittedly this is not, but we're throwing genre conventions out the window, so the fact that we have historic questions coming in here makes sense. Like, the War of the Roses is just two families going at it without clear heirs, and ultimately we end up having the Tudors come out. And you're just kind of like, how did we even get here? How did we even get here? And neither side is clearly winning. We have Prince Hal, and then that goes south, and we have Richard III, and that goes south. And this is something Shakespeare is starkly aware of. So, yes, the argument that a king should produce an heir for the prosperity and peace of the kingdom makes sense. Again, there are issues on both sides. Yes, there have been points where it hasn't been a biological heir, or it shouldn't have been a biological heir. Marcus Aurelius, why? And there have definitely been problems with children coming to rule. And then, you know, all the families taking over because the child can't rule, and power split. But that's exactly the issue. The issue is the power split that will occur if there's no clear heir designated by Leontes, preferably of his own lineage. On the other side of this argument is Paulina pointing out the fact that Apollo's oracle had stated that Leontes would not have an heir until the lost baby that he chucked onto a different island would be found. And she points out that, like, last time you went against Apollo, 2 people died. You lost your son, who was your heir at the time. You lost your wife. And this is, in fact, historically a question that has occurred throughout history. And I say a great question because there is actually... It's a well-known story to the point where there are several surviving versions from different tragic Greek writers. But it is the story of... I am going to say the names wrong. I'm going to say the names wrong. So I'm just not going to bother trying to say the names. But basically the story of, do you bury somebody who was considered a traitor to the kingdom? Yeah. So it's in the line of stories with Oedipus Rex, the king that we covered last season, who killed his father and slept with his mother, and then everything went horribly, horribly wrong from there. But it's actually the story of his children, where his 2 sons went at it, and one of them was considered proper lineage, the other was not. They ultimately killed each other. The uncle took power, buried the son that was the correct lineage, and decreed that the other son, takes Y, decreed that the other son, who was a traitor to the kingdom, could not be buried. Which, in Greece, is against the gods. So the religious answer is that this guy needs to be buried. And this is a very important family obligation that one sister is trying to actually do. And it becomes a question then of whether or not she can be punished because she disobeyed the king but obeyed the gods. Because that's the argument she makes. She goes ahead, buries her brother, and says, I was speaking to a higher power. I was following the orders of a higher power and not an earthly kingdom. And you don't get a clear answer on that one either because we kill her and then things go wrong for the uncle, so. But that's exactly, like, this is a conversation that Paulina and this lord are now having as well. Who do you listen to? Do you care for the earthly kingdom and its needs, or do you care to the higher power? And that's something that's carried on even now. There is a question of do you care for the rules of your society or the rules of your religion? And it always depends on whose perspective you look at. because there have been people who have protested against rules and laws that have limited their religion and often have died for that. You see that in Christianity, you see that in Islamic religions, you see that even in something like Buddhism. The Dalai Lama. That's a whole issue right now happening between Tibet and China. So it is an issue even now of who you listen to. And Leontes is sort of in one of the worst positions for it because he is obligated in both senses of the word. Now, a lot of people who are regular people like you or I, we're not in a position of major power that might end a kingdom if we make the wrong decision. Leontes is in fact the king, so he has the lives of all his subjects to think about. For us, it's more of our lives and how we respond to things. Or we snap and start taking out other people, but that's not something I want to get into today, and also don't do that. Don't do that. But Leontes here does have the serious question of whether or not he obeys Apollo or tries to take care of his kingdom. Now, Paulina tries to have it both ways, and she sort of does this, like I said, when she mentions Alexander the Great, though I'm not quite sure we agree on that point. But the argument she's making here is like, you can have it both ways. By obeying Apollo, he's not going to punish you for obeying him. Like, the gods should see everything out fine if you obey their commandments. And if you look at this, like, Paulina's throwing some major hints down that she is aware of something. Because after this very brief conversation, when she exacts a promise from Leontes that he will not get married, the wording's real weird here, because she doesn't just ask him not to get married. Like, she first asks that he get permission from her, and then allows her to find his wife, and then specifies that she'll basically be Hermione. And you're kind of like, what's happening here? Because Paulina seems to have changed again. Earlier in the play, she was very aggressive towards Leontes and telling him off when he was acting stupid. But after we lose Hermione and Maximilius, she then comes in tears, cries with Leontes, and hugs him. And we see the beginning of forgiveness. And suddenly, 16 years later, she seems just constantly to be reminding him about his dead wife, her dead friend, Hermione. And how good Hermione was. And how pretty Hermione was. And don't look at that other girl. Don't look at that other girl. Hermione. And you're kind of like, I thought you were trying to forgive him. So this should be a hint to us that something in fact is up here. And her getting specific about finding Hermione, but probably older than the Hermione you knew, should kind of be like, we're not a tragedy, are we? Like, this conversation is just purely too weird for a tragic outcome of spreading the bodies around. Because this is not Hamlet crazy. This is not Hamlet talking about somebody being a fishmonger and words, words, words. It's not that nutso side of things. This is Paulina being very serious, very specific, in the weirdest way that tells us something is up, and we just have to get there with Leontes. And we see Leontes has changed. Because when Florenzel and Perdita come in, he is very willing to listen to them, even when they're undercut right away. So they start with the story, and he's like, okay, yeah, cool. And this lord comes in, and he's like, the king of Bohemia is here, his son has run away with a shepherd's daughter, and he's real pissed. And Leontes is like, okay, so she's not a princess. And Florencel's like, she will be when I marry her, so you're not married. Doesn't look like I'm going to get there. Like, but look at her, she's beautiful, and I like her, and it's not fair. And Leontes is actually like, yeah, okay, look, why don't I bring your father in, and we will try and just hash all this out. I promise you, we will give you a chance to talk. We will listen. Leontes has, in fact, learned from his mistakes. And we see that wholly when Florenzel and Perdita come in, and he just has this moment of, maybe I can rectify a mistake I made in my youth. Because we are seeing, he says, a reflection of Paulinus when he was younger. Like, Leontes is like, you look exactly like your father. There is no doubt there. If I were 20 years younger, I wouldn't even think twice. Like, you were my brother and we did something nuts. So he's seeing the mistakes he's made previously. And I think he's also seeing the mistakes he made reflected in the anger, the sheer, unadulterated anger that Paulinus is displaying now. And he says, we will listen. We want the whole story, but we will listen. So, again, Paulina constantly bringing up Hermione seems really weird, because Leontes has learned his lesson. He's improved. It seems like he's even become a better king because of it, though there is a concern for the heir. So why is Paulina still harping on this issue? It's because she knows something that we and nobody else don't know yet. We're gonna know it soon, because we're almost at the end of the play. But we have actually again moved out of that tragedy trajectory from this weird conversation we're having with Paulina and Leontes actually listening. And we're gonna very quickly learn who Perdita is. We should have gotten that hint when Paulina was like, stop looking at her, like, I know she's cute, but you should think of your wife. And Leontes admits, I was thinking of my wife when I looked at her. If Florenzel looks like Paulinus for when he was younger, Perdita's got something of her mother in him. Her. Geez, too many people. So if there's something recognizable in Perdita that Leontes sees her and thinks, I wish my wife was here. Which, again, buys into that concept that there's something wholly objectively recognizable about the upper class. But it changes here with Leontes into something recognizable about those you love. And your own children. Which is kind of a nice change. I don't think we're in a tragedy anymore. There was a lot of concern at the end of Act 4, the Act 5 to switch some things up. We're gonna get a weird solution to all this, but it's going to be a happier one. Maybe it's not gonna be the comedy, magically everything's fixed, yay, but it's gonna be better than bodies littering the place. Who even knows what Paulina has up her sleeve? But we are going to find out next time when we actually finish up A Winter's Tale. So I'm going to get reading, and I hope you do too. See you next time.